Nope. How about now? Okay, great. You know, I was going to teach from down there, but nobody came any closer than right here, so I said, nice try. I'll bring the podium to you. I already like it better. So I learned a lot about my trip to Israel when I heard other people talk about it. The first thing I learned was when Steve announced it the first time that I was going, he said I was going on a mission trip. I said, I didn't know that. I'm such a great guy. Man, what a guy. And then someone else said that I was going to share pictures, and I couldn't help but, with that wording, think I was going to show, here's a picture of me and Rod at Starbucks. Here's a picture of us at the beach. Here's a picture of us riding a bike together. But hopefully I'll be able to share not only pictures of things that we did, but more importantly, things that you would care about, things that will connect back to the spiritual. And ever since I've been back, I have been improving Bible classes by raising my hand and telling the teacher, well, actually, I've been there, so I'd like to say a few words if that's okay. And the elders said, well, look, let's get that out of your system, and you just teach one class and try to get it out, okay? And so we'll see if that works. But I did learn a lot, and I'm thankful that they have asked me to share this, and we'll do that today. I want to ask you this. What do you think of when you think of Israel? What do you think of when you think of Israel? Let me mention this real quick. I'm going to share my contact information at the beginning and end. I'm going to talk about some things that may interest you, some opportunities to visit there that you might want to take part in. And I'm going to have a lot of notes and pictures, and if you want information on any of that, you can contact me. So we'll put that at the beginning and then at the end. And my email is pretty easy, matt@housetohouse.com. But what do you think of when you think of Israel? On the left side, you have a map of what it looked like during Jesus' day, and on the right side, you have a map of what it looks like now. But what do you think of when you think of it? I've always kind of thought of it as a map in the back of my Bible that I didn't fully understand. I've thought of it as the name of a group of people, right? The Israelites, named after Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And I've always thought of it as a desert land. Like if you walked from the top to the bottom, you wouldn't make it because you would die, because it's desert wilderness, no food, no drink. Well, then why does the Bible refer to it as a land of milk and honey, if that's what it looks like? But in actuality, you're going to see every type of geography in the country. In Jeremiah chapter 49 and verse 19, it says, "Behold, like a lion coming up from the jungle of the Jordan." Have you ever thought of Israel as a place with jungles? Then again in Joshua 21:32, it says, "And out of the tribe of Naphtali, Kedesh in Galilee with its pasture lands." Now we're familiar with pasture lands. We have a lot of those in Georgia, a lot of those in the south. But have you ever thought of Israel as a place that had pasture lands? Well, it did. As a matter of fact, there is every type of geography that you can think of. Yes, deserts, but also the beach. Also seas and rivers and waterfalls and even a snow-capped mountain. And so all of the pictures that you see here are from Israel today. Another thing I learned by going there is not only the geography and maybe the different kinds of land that they had like this, but I also learned about the distance. Things are not as far apart as I had always assumed that they were in the Bible. Sometimes someone goes on a journey and I'm thinking, wow, a 6-month journey in a covered wagon, as it were, with no help, no food along the way, when in actuality it may have just taken them a couple of days. And so things are not as far apart as you might think that they are. Israel is actually about the size of the state of New Jersey. Hand if you've ever been to New Jersey. I have been? Oh, more than I thought. Great. For those of us that haven't been, that might not help a lot. What about Georgia? Has anybody been to Georgia? Great. We've all been to Georgia. Well, Georgia is actually much bigger than Israel. It's about 7 times larger than the country of Israel. So if you've ever driven from Fort Oglethorpe or Chickamauga or LOJ down to Valdosta or somewhere like that, you have made a much longer trip than it would take to get from the top of Israel to the bottom of it. So I want us to start at the top of Israel and travel down and see what it is that we'll learn. So we'll start in the north in a place called Dan. Dan is an interesting area because it stands in the shadow of Mount Hermon, which is the mountain that you see here. And it's actually a snow-capped mountain at the top of Jordan. And I've never in my life thought of snow in Israel. But when you see Mount Hermon, it's almost always, if not always, covered in snow. And it's actually going to produce the headwaters that will then later be the Jordan River. And I took a video of the Jordan that I wanted to share just so you can kind of get a sense of it. And it won't play on the PowerPoint because I don't know how to do that. But if you want to see it later, it's really good. But what you would see in the video is that it's actually a lot faster than you might think. I went to the Jordan River one morning. Oh, there we go. So when we think about the Jordan, we maybe think of something that is small. Of course, it's not that far across. Some of us might try to jump across that, and I'd like to see you try. But it's not that far. It's possible. But it's also moving pretty fast, and we'll talk some more about that later. But that all flows out of the snow-capped mountains of Mount Hermon. And then here's a picture that I took a little further downstream where it's a little wider and not as fast. But in this area, this northern part of Israel, in the shadow of Mount Hermon, a large ancient city has been discovered that goes back to 2,000 years before Christ. And that is 2,000 years before Jesus was born. And I'm sorry to have Rod in the picture in the way there, but he got in the way of my shot. But it was originally called Laish. You can see that in the book of Judges, or Leshem in the book of Joshua. And so it's something, it's named different, but you read about it even in the Old Testament already, before the Israelites conquered. And during the time of the Judges, the tribe of Dan captured this city and they renamed it for themselves. They renamed it Dan. And they immediately, this is so sad, set up their own false gods. I mean, God had helped them get the land. They conquer this people with God's help, name the city Dan after their forefather, and then immediately get into idol worship. And it's during the time of the kings that Jeroboam set up his own worship in Dan. But it was all part of a very well-watered valley on a major trade route, and so a lot of people would come through this area. And it actually rained when Rod and I were there, and it rains a lot in the northern part of Israel in Dan. But I always thought of Israel as a place of desert where so many of the stories we read where it doesn't rain, but in Dan it rains, and it rains a lot. But then the location, in Judges chapter 20 and verse 1, it says, all the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba. And this is one of those interesting things, like the Bible says Beersheba, but it's one of those, I think, King James translation type things. It's actually Beersheba. If you go there and you say Beersheba, they just laugh at you. But it's Beersheba. But you're going to read that phrase from Dan to Beersheba about 9 times in the Old Testament. And it really was just kind of a proverb, a summary of this is the whole of the territory, all the way from Dan to Beersheba. Rod and I actually made that drive from Dan to Beersheba. And yesterday, as I screenshot this, that was about a 2-hour and 52-minute ride, car ride. Can you imagine the whole of Israel could be covered by car in under 3 hours? And that's the terminology they used to use to describe the whole of their territory. That's the same amount of time it takes for us to drive to Macon, or to Florence, Alabama, or to Knoxville or Nashville, right in about this same amount of time. But then also the archaeology was interesting too. It gives a lot of insight into life during Abraham's time, and it proves certain things that are in the Bible, stories, places, names. There's actually been a stone here discovered with an inscription celebrating a victory over the king of the house of David. You know, archaeology is interesting. They're like, we haven't found any proof of the Hittites. The Bible's a liar. Hittites don't exist. Then they find proof of the Hittites. We've never found proof of David. They find proof of David. We've never found proof of someone named Pilate outside of the Bible. Then archaeology continues to just uncover things, and what do they find? Proof of Pilate outside of the Bible. And they always will. And I used to think, why has more not been found? Well, you've got entire civilizations on top of this area. Imagine if somebody came to your house and said, hey, I want to poke around in here and see if I can find something under your foundation that dates back 2,000 years ago. No way. And so it is with them. People are everywhere. Only like 1% of the Holy Lands has ever actually been excavated. And so it's no wonder we haven't found more proofs, but given enough time, all of the Bible will be confirmed, even through extra-biblical sources. But in 1979, a gate was discovered called Abraham's Gate. And it's not named after that Abraham, which is confusing, but it was named after the Abraham that discovered it. But you see the arches that are in the gate, basically at top of where the door is in the middle. And these arches are interesting because up until they were discovered in 1979, everybody thought that the Romans had invented the architecture that used arches. But this proves that the Middle East did it at least 1,500 years earlier. And it's the oldest intact archway in the world. And here in the foreground, you can see a representation, an artistic representation of what the city would have looked like on the other side of that arch and that gateway that leads into it. And the Bible actually talks about this city during the time of Abraham. In Genesis 14:14, it says, when Abraham heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and they went in pursuit as far as Dan. So they stole Lot, kidnapped him, and Abraham said, not on my watch, took all his men, mounted up, and they rode. And where did they ride to? To Dan. And since Abraham visited this area, he may very well have walked these steps and passed under the archway that you saw in the picture. Another thing that you see in Dan that's interesting to us as Bible students is the seat of judgment. Here in this city, and you see this in a lot of ancient cities, you're going to see a seat-looking area right inside the gate. And the first mention of a city gate is found in Genesis 19:1. And it says, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. What a weird place to sit. Why hang out in the gate? It's like people that just hang out like, on their front porch or at the store all day. It's like sometimes I see men at a construction site just sitting on the back of the tailgate. I think they're just talking about screwdrivers or something. But what are you guys doing just hanging out all day? Why hang out at the gate? Well, it was the place where commerce was done, business was done. And that makes sense because people are passing in and out all the time. If you ever want to go to a foreclosure auction, you know where those are? The courthouse steps. Well, if you wanted to do business back then, where was it done? At the gate. And so you see these gates in all of the cities that you're going to see. Moses, in the law of Moses, told parents to bring a rebellious son to the city gate where the elders would examine the evidence and pass judgment. You remember in Ruth, chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, as Boaz redeems Ruth, well, where does he do that? He does that at the city gate. In Proverbs 22:22, it says, do not rob the poor because he's poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. What gate? Well, when business was being conducted, when law was being handled and judgments were being made at the city gate, at the seat of judgment. And then Amos 5:15 says, hate evil, love good, and establish justice in the gate. Now there was a raised seat for a judge, and then there was a bench along the wall for the elders. And so here in this mural that you can see a little bit, you've got the judge sitting up with his assistant, and people are in line waiting all day to get to the judge. And then here I am standing in the judgment seat. And hopefully it's a little more Zechariah 8:16 and a little less Matthew 7:1 and James, the good kind of judging and not the bad kind of judging. But then I wanted to, at the end of each of these geographical sections, share some lessons that we learn from the things that we see. The first thing is that disobedience to God leads to punishment and loss of blessings. And it always does, even in our world today. Though God may reveal himself in different ways, God is still in control, and disobedience leads to punishment and a lack of blessings. In Judges chapter 18, the Danites came and they conquered a city named Ephraim, and they stole their idols and one of their false priests, and they took him to Dan. And they set up idolatry in Dan, and archaeology proves that. You can even see proof of it there. But then after that, after the divided kingdom, you remember the 10 tribes of the north split, and the 2 tribes of the south remained basically God's people at the time. But Jeroboam became the king of the north, of the region that would have included Dan. And to keep his citizens from going back to Jerusalem, he made changes to their worship. And in 1 Kings chapter 12, we see that he made at least 4 changes. He changed the object. He said, we're not worshiping God anymore. They're worshiping 2 golden calves. He changed the place, no longer Jerusalem, now it's Dan. He changed the priesthood. It's no longer Levites. It's now just whoever we can find. And then he also changed the time. God's people worshiped in Jerusalem in the 7th month, according to Leviticus 23, and his people worshiped in Dan in the 8th month. And so it's just an important lesson to notice that we cannot change God's plan. Though it may be to a preference of ours, we have to stick to the pattern that God has given us. And we see a clear picture of that in Dan. The Bible says over and over something like this that was recorded in 2 Kings 17:22. It says, the people of Israel walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's talking about when he set up this false way to worship God. And all the people of the north continually did that, just like Jeroboam had done. And this is a really sad part, and then we'll move on to the next area. Because of this sin, because of the idolatry, because of changing the place, the time, the access, and the object of the worship, the tribe of Dan lost their inheritance, and they lost their identity. When you get to 1 Chronicles chapters 2 through 12, it recounts all the tribes and talks about what they've done, what land they own. You know what tribe is missing? The tribe of Dan. When you get to the book of Revelation, the 144,000 that are sealed in Revelation 7:5 through 8 mention all the tribes of Israel except for one. They don't mention the tribe of Dan. Disobedience to God always leads to punishment and a loss of blessings. Next, still in the north, is a little area called Caesarea Philippi. And maybe I'm just naive, I guess, but when I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to go to a city, I'm expecting there to be at least a gas station or a store or something, right? But some of these ancient cities that you go to, literally the only thing that is there is the ruins of the ancient city. And so it is really with Caesarea Philippi. I think there was maybe one restaurant down the road, and that was it. But Caesarea Philippi was also in the north. And it was a place with temples to false gods. And so you can kind of see here what an artist's rendition of what would have been in front of the pictures that I'm about to show you. But in this area, Caesarea Philippi, you can still see the remains. This is where the building on the left would have been. And then the one in the middle is here on the right. You can still see the remains of some of the pagan temple ruins that were set up. Now, I have a rock on my desk at home that says Caesarea Philippi, and it is a rock that fell off from up there and hit me in the head. Now, the only way I know it hit me in the head, I felt it first of all and said, what in the world? But Rod told me he saw it fall off the mountain. So now you have to decide, is that more likely, or is it more likely that Rod hit me in the head with a rock? I could go either way. But I have a copy of that, or I have that rock, not a copy of it, that rock on my desk at home. But Caesarea Philippi is a famous place because it's where Jesus asked a famous question. In this backdrop of all these false gods, confusion over religion, Jesus asked Peter something in Matthew 16. Verse 13 says, Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, Who do people say the Son of Man is? And then you'll remember they listed people, right? You're Elijah. You're one of the prophets. You're John the Baptist. And all of those make sense because the prophets talked about a Messiah, and Elijah was prophesied to come. John the Baptist was that Elijah, but he was killed. And so some people, especially Herod, who had killed him when they heard of Jesus, said, oh, this is John the Baptist, come back from the afterlife. So after they ask all these questions and answer who they think it is, look at Peter's answer starting in verse 15. He said to them, Jesus, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter replied, You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you Peter, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So what lesson do we learn from this question and this answer at Caesarea Philippi? I think a lesson is that for you, it doesn't matter who people say Jesus is. For you specifically and individually, it only matters who you say Jesus is. You won't be saved just because your parents thought Jesus was Lord and Savior. You won't be saved just because we do and the elders do and the preacher. But you'll only be saved if you also believe that. And so this is a question for us, who do you say that Jesus is? All right, next, going further south into this region of Galilee, if I were to ask you to just name one city in the Bible, what would most people say? I see a few mouths. Let's bravely say it together. Jerusalem. All right? Jerusalem. If you're playing Bible trivia, you can just go ahead and ring in and say Jesus or Jerusalem, and you'll get like half the questions right, I think, right? So when we think of the Bible, we think of Jerusalem, and there's a good reason for that. We'll talk about Jerusalem in a few minutes, but it's interesting. That doesn't seem to be where Jesus spent the majority of his ministry. Isn't that interesting? But it seems like he spent it in this middle region, maybe the southern part of the north of this area of Galilee. Now, in the New Testament, this is the name of the area, Galilee, but you only see that name 7 times in the Old Testament. Now, why do you think that is? They didn't just invent new land. They called it something else. So if we know what it was called, we can look in the Old Testament and we can see Galilee come up a lot. And it was actually called Naphtali. And you even see that in the New Testament, Matthew 4:13, and leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. Well, where in the world is the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali? Well, Galilee. It's the same thing. Called one in the Old Testament and another one in the New. So Jesus was born in Bethlehem, brought up in Nazareth, and preached in Jerusalem. But a lot of his ministry was in this area of Galilee and in the city of specifically Capernaum. And this is also where he performed many of his miracles. And you can see Capernaum now today, even some of the remains that have been preserved. What's in the backdrop? The Sea of Galilee. So this is a city where Jesus based a lot of his work and his ministry. And as a matter of fact, in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 1, it says, getting into a boat, he crossed over and came to his own city, which the Bible then later tells us is the city of Capernaum. Now, Jesus performed his first miracle here in this region of Galilee. In John 2:11, it says that he turned the water to wine at the wedding feast of Cana. And this is pretty amazing. Cana is not far from Capernaum, but Jesus' second miracle was to heal someone's son in the city of Capernaum while he was still in the city of Cana. I mean, Jesus performed a miracle not only in front of him that people saw, but he was able to perform miracles at a distance. And this is the area that Jesus started that public ministry in. And these cities are about 20 miles away. The disciple Nathanael, some people think that's the same apostle Bartholomew, is from the city of Capernaum. And then even Peter lived in Capernaum, and his mother-in-law who was healed. And if you visit Capernaum now, you can see this site, a church building has been built atop of what most people think was the home of Peter. Now, that idea and thought dates back to, I think, the 1st or 2nd century, maybe 3rd century after Christ. And so this is a pretty old tradition, but it's not one of those that we can know for sure. But Capernaum in the area of Galilee also contains the Jordan River. And on this map, you can see just an aerial view starting in the snow-capped mountains of Mount Hermon, going down until it reaches the Sea of Galilee, the body of water at the top, going all the way down until it reaches the Dead Sea at the bottom. But the Jordan River continues from the base of Mount Hermon into the Sea of Galilee. Did you know it's only 223 miles long? I mean, that sounds long, but it's only about 124 miles as the crow flies, okay? It only covers 124 miles of distance if you take out the zigzags. But did you know that's not big enough to be in the top 200 rivers in the world? I wasn't actually able to find out the exact number because they quit keeping track about 150. And so it may not be but the 300th, 400th, 500th biggest river in our world. But it's important for different reasons. But just because it's small in comparison to most rivers doesn't mean that it's easy to cross. It's swift in some parts. When I was there earlier, I showed you the part that was kind of swift. I could have gotten across that pretty easily, but I for sure would have had to jump in and swim. There's no way I could have walked across the Jordan River, especially imagine trying to carry children or animals or important documents or food that you didn't want to get wet. And so even though we think, well, the Jordan's small, what's it matter? Whoop-de-doo, God parted such a small river. But it still would have been something hard for the people to get across. And God made it possible when it might have otherwise been impossible. Now, there are a lot of important mentions of the Jordan River. Obviously, these are all small. So if you want to see notes of these later, I can share them. Let me quickly share a few things that happened at the Jordan. Genesis 32, Jacob crossed it and then wrestled with God. We've studied that before, and we think that was the pre-incarnate Christ, Jesus, before he permanently put on flesh and came to earth, wrestling with Jacob. Deuteronomy 11:31, he tells the people to cross the Jordan and take possession of the land. Joshua 3 and 4, the river was miraculously dammed up even though it was flood season, and people crossed a dry riverbed. In 2 Samuel 16:14, the King David and all the people with him arrived weary at the Jordan and refreshed themselves. 1 Kings 17, Elijah predicts the drought, and then God tells him to go to the brook Cherith, and the brook Cherith is a tributary of the Jordan River. 2 Kings 2, Elijah performs a miracle, strikes the Jordan. He and Elisha cross over on dry ground, and then Elijah is taken to heaven in a whirlwind from that spot. In 2 Kings 5, Elisha tells Naaman the leper to wash in the Jordan, and he objects. Why? He says, we got better rivers than the Jordan back home. Why don't I just go bathe in one of those? And his servant says, yeah, but if God had asked some great thing of you, wouldn't you do it? And he said, yeah. And so the servant says wisely, well, then just do the thing that he asked. And so he does it, and what happens? He's healed. And where is that? In the Jordan River. Of course, it's not about the water, is it? But it's about obedience to God. 1 Chronicles 12:15, these are the men who crossed the Jordan in the first month when it was overflowing its banks. And then finally, the New Testament talks about the Jordan a good bit too, and this is so interesting. Not as much as we might think. Mark 1:5, and all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him, John the Baptizer, and were being baptized in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Then a few verses later, Mark chapter 1, verse 9, Jesus is baptized there in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. Now this is what's interesting. The last mention of the Jordan River, as prominent and famous as it is in John chapter 10, verses 40 through 42. It says, he went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first, and there he remained, Jesus. And many came to him, and they said, John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true, and many believed in him there. Well, this is what's interesting. The Jordan River is mentioned from Genesis to Zechariah, and in all 4 Gospels. Why was this area mentioned all throughout the Bible, and then never mentioned again in God's new kingdom, in God's new covenant, in God's church? Jesus is the last one mentioned crossing the old Jordan. And I think it's because it's no longer God's kingdom that is represented in a physical way, but now God's kingdom is spiritual. And maybe it's as if Jesus crossed the Jordan the last time it's mentioned to let us know the old covenant is done and a new way is being ushered in. We're no longer crossing over a physical Jordan as God's people, and the geography no longer matters. Very possible, just something to think about. Now, where does Jesus go after his baptism in the Jordan River? Well, he goes off into the wilderness. You know, this is what I think of, or I have thought of when I think of Israel my whole life. And though it's not, as you can see, the dominant topography or all, surely, there is still areas that look like we might think of it. And this is the wilderness that Jesus goes into to be tempted by Satan after his baptism. So he goes from the beautiful, life-giving Jordan River to the Judean wilderness. It's hot like we think of, but it's not flat like a desert like we might think, but it's full of mountains and full of animals. Now, how long was Jesus tempted? Anybody know? 40 days. Now, have you ever thought why 40 days? Sometimes you see a number in the Bible and there's something very significant about it. And sometimes you see a number in the Bible and you want to make something significant about it, so you shove a bunch of meaning into it, okay? But is there anything else that God's people did that had to do with the number 40 and a time spent in the desert full of temptation and trials? Well, we think back to the 40 spies that were sent into the Promised Land, and they were there for how long? Well, 40 days. And their failure in that situation resulted in them wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And so we can't prove it. The Bible doesn't give us that commentary, and maybe it's an overreach. But we might also think maybe there's something to this. God's people were in the wilderness, their wilderness, for 40 days and then 40 years, and they failed. Now here Jesus is in his wilderness for 40 days, and he resists the temptation. Jeremy, did you raise your hand? That's true. That's true as well. Yep, that's right. Very good. This is more of a sermon, not a class, Jeremy, but nice try. I'm just kidding. I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, and then the Jordan River flows into the Sea of Galilee. Now you see here a boat in the Sea of Galilee. You would have seen hundreds of boats on the Sea of Galilee in Jesus' time. You see almost no boats on the Sea of Galilee today unless they are taking out a church group, typically. You see a few fishers, but a lot of them fish from the shore. Not as many boats for sure, but in the Old Testament this was called the Sea of Chinnereth. In the New Testament you see it called the Lake of Gennesaret, Lake Tiberias, Sea of Galilee, or simply just the sea. What's interesting about the Sea of Galilee, one thing is that it's only 33 miles in circumference. And if you were to look at the top 200 lists of size seas, the Sea of Galilee would not appear on that list. And similarly, they stopped counting at about 100. And I couldn't find any list. Maybe it's not even the top 300 or 400 in the size of seas that we have in our world. So it's not impressive in that way. Actually, in some parts of it, you can see across, like you can in this picture, to the other side. You could definitely see a boat on the water and know if you knew the boat, if you knew the person in the boat. Or you could even have a conversation like you see, I think it's John 21, where Jesus and the apostles have a conversation while he's on the shore and they're in the boat on the Sea of Galilee. But it is big enough, too, that there are some spots that you can't see across. And there's some spots you wouldn't know someone on a boat out in the middle of it. When I was there, the water was very choppy. It was exhausting trying to swim or even especially just to float in it. And not only that, the seabed was made of sharp rocks that hurt to walk on. I mean, it was painful until I got out to the point where I could swim. When it was no water or very shallow, it really wasn't any fun. It wasn't until you got out far enough to be, cover most of your body that it was easier because you could avoid the rocks. Now, most boats that were on the Sea of Galilee were small. What's interesting is in 1986, there was a bit of a drought in the area, and a lot of parts of the seabed that had not been seen in hundreds or maybe thousands of years were exposed. And when that happened, they found this boat. And it's called the Jesus boat. Now, there's no proof that Jesus ever saw this specific boat, though he could have, but it's definitely a first century boat. When you think about the story where Jesus is on the Sea of Galilee and he's asleep and they wake him up, I've always thought of maybe from a Disney movie, like a double-decker boat, like with an underneath, and they have to go climb down the stairs and find the guy. But this is what the size generally would have been. So it would have been more like Jesus was just across the other side of the boat. Now, there were 16 ports around the Sea of Galilee in the time of Jesus, and there would have been constant traffic on the water, but not as much anymore. Now, think about some of the famous events that happened here. In Luke 5, the miracle of the fish. Peter and Andrew have been fishing all night, caught nothing. And Jesus says, hey, go out and try one more time. And if you've seen The Chosen, that Peter in that portrayal is does not want to do it. No thanks. I'm tired. I don't want to see a magic trick. I got to go. But Jesus looks him in the eyes and says, for me. And it's convicting enough that he does, and he goes out, and what happens? He catches so many fish that the boat can't take it, and it starts to capsize, which of course is true. And Jesus then says to him, come with me and I'll make you fishers of men. Have you ever thought about what kind of fish that they catch? I did, and I looked into that. It's mainly tilapia, carp, and how about this, catfish? Even all the way in Israel, our southerners and our catfish, you can have it there. That's what the Sea of Galilee produces. But in Mark 4, Jesus calmed the sea. Verse 39 says, he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And that happened on the Sea of Galilee. In Matthew 14, Jesus and Peter both walk on the water. In John 21:6, as I mentioned earlier, and this is so cool to see this, what happens at the beginning of Jesus' ministry as he calls Peter? He says to him, hey, while you're fishing, cast your net on the other side, and all the fish come up. And Peter falls at his feet and says, my Lord and my God. Then look at the end of his earthly ministry, John 21:6. Jesus appears to the apostles after the resurrection, and he's standing on the shore. They don't know who it is, and he calls out to them, have you caught anything? And they say, no, not yet. And he again says, cast your net on the other side. And you know what happens? The exact same thing that happened the first time. I didn't realize this happened twice. So many of the stories we read in the Bible, you read it and you're like, oh, yeah, I read that in another gospel. But this is a different situation. You know what Peter's reaction is to that when he sees the fish coming in? He jumps out of the boat and swims to Jesus. It's as if he again is saying, I surrender myself to you. And God again reminds him that he'll be a fisher of men. And then Psalm 89:9 talks about some of these things. It says, you rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. And Jeremy Barton pointed this out to me in his good class on the Messianic Psalms on Wednesday night. And so Jesus is predicted to do this, and we see that he's the complete master of the sea and the waves. So let's share some lessons learned from some of these things. What makes a place special or a person special? Well, Mary and Joseph were special, but they weren't really. They were poor. Who were they? The Sea of Galilee is special, but it's not really. It's not even the top 200 or 300 seas in the world by size. The Jordan River is special, but it's not really. It's not that impressive of a river, and it's not even that large. But what made these people and places special? God was in them. And that's encouraging to us because we're really not that special, even the best of us. But we can be if God is in us. And the Sea of Galilee was the backdrop for the Sermon on the Mount. I think this is the place that a lot of people think could have been. Nobody actually knows the exact spot, but the backdrop for the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to share some videos at the end that you might want to check out. You should check out. They're really good. And in one of them, a guy stands basically at the bottom of the shore, and another guy climbs all the way up to the top. The younger guy climbs. I thought that was interesting. And yet they have a conversation just like you and I are talking now, and he's able to hear them even at several football field lengths of distance. Well, why? Well, because this area, this geography provides a natural amplification of the voice. And so I've always thought, why did Jesus get on a boat and go out? Could people really hear him better? Why have the Sermon on the Mount? Could people really hear him better? Yes, they could. But they didn't have microphones like we do now, but God's nature provided them. But then in this same area, this area of Galilee, this kind of southern part of the northern area, is the city of Nazareth. This is a picture of the city now. This was, of course, Jesus' hometown as a child. But even in the current city, they have, and this is a picture I took just kind of walking down some side streets that I thought was really pretty in the old part of the city. But even in this old part of the city, they have some reconstruction of what it would have looked like in Jesus' day, and this is a picture from that. They also have a recreation of the synagogue that would have been in Nazareth. So this is about as close as you can get to seeing what it would have looked like for the church building that Jesus would have gone to for Sabbath as a child. And they even have these containers that would have held scrolls. No doubt Jesus pulled the scroll of Isaiah out of one of these to read. One place in the Bible it says he goes and he reads as was his custom. So when the doors were open, Jesus as a boy was there. And this was the place, the kind of place that he would have been. But there's something sad from all of this as well. This is the only Church of Christ in the country of Israel. And so I actually wore that same shirt when I preached there that day, and I'm wearing it now, you know. So it's just kind of little pieces like that just make all the difference, right? But this is the only Church of Christ that's in the country. And so it's sad, and we'll talk about this more with Bethlehem and how Israel's Christendom faith is statistically now. But it's just sad to see in the area where the church was born, sometimes so little of it. Let's go down further to the middle. Maybe the most exciting part, maybe one of the most famous pictures that any of us have seen or think about when we think about Israel, is this picture looking to the city of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. In Psalm 137, it talks about a time when the children of Israel were carried away out of this area and into Babylonian captivity. Now why? Well, because of their disobedience and their disbelief. In verse 1, Psalm 137, verse 1 says, "By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept, when we remembered Zion," or Jerusalem. Then verses 5 through 6, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy." Now, why would they place so much value in a place? Just a spot on the map. Well, it represented the land that God had given them. And it represented all the promises of God. And so as a captive, someone taken away in exile, you look back at Jerusalem as, we will one day have this again because God has promised this to us. And it gave them great hope and joy. I'd like to spend more time, but for the sake of time, I'll just skip through and share a few points. Why was Jerusalem so highly prized? Who cares about Jerusalem? What made it such a good place? Well, in that time, you had to have maybe three things, basically. You had to have water. There's a spring running through called the Gihon Spring that provided water for the city. It's also in an important position. It was out of the trade routes. And so you could kind of safely be there without people passing in and out all of the time. But it was close enough to them that you could get your military out in any direction quickly. But then finally, and most importantly, for spiritual reasons. The Spirit of God dwelt here. When they built the temple, you remember the Spirit of God himself was in the Holy of Holies in the temple. In this area where you see the gold dome now, which is a Muslim holy site, a Muslim place of worship now, is the actual area where the temple would have been. But even before the temple was built there by Solomon, something important happened on that same location, most likely before it. It's where Abraham went to offer Isaac as a sacrifice to God. So you've got Abraham offering a sacrifice to God in this exact spot. You've got the temple being built in this exact spot. And then basically in this exact area, you have the sacrifice of Jesus. And so a lot of important things happened here. It's interesting when you read the Bible, you always talk about going up to Jerusalem and up to the temple. Why is that? Because sometimes you look at a map and it says we went up to Jerusalem, and this place is actually north of Jerusalem. You would think it would say we went down to Jerusalem. I do that in the South, though, all the time. I say, yeah, I'm going to go up to the store real quick, or I'm going up to, Atlanta. It's not up. But why would they say up? Well, Jerusalem was a city literally built on a hill. And then on top of that hill was the Temple Mount. And so wherever you were in the area, when you went to Jerusalem, you went up, and when you went to the temple, you went up again. Here's a model of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. It's in a museum. Boy, you can really, the detail pops on that from a distance, doesn't it? But this is a reconstruction of the city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. But in this area, you can see that part at the front, the temple. The temple would have dominated the landscape at the time. It's actually so big, and here's just a zoomed in picture. showing the temple, how big the complex was. But it was so big that you could fit, that's 26 NFL-sized fields on the top of it. So no matter where you were in the area or wherever you were in the city, you looked up to the temple. Now, most of the walls that you see when you look at Jerusalem today, most of these walls are not original to Jesus' time. That was kind of a bummer when I learned that, because I'm thinking like, man, I'm looking at just exactly what Jesus saw. No, very little. The city has been torn down and rebuilt and torn down and rebuilt so many times that the walls that we see, the majority of them weren't built until the 1500s. But parts of other walls that you can see all over the city date back to the time of Jesus. One of the most famous sections of that wall is the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall. And it's so important because it's one of the biggest and most intact, largest, and best sections of the temple complex wall that they have left. But it's also the closest part to the temple and the Holy of Holies. There's some part on the southern wall that's still intact. They almost seem not to care about that. I went here a few times, and it was like you went to an anthill and you chopped the top off and how the ants come out. That's how it felt there with so many people. But you go to the southern wall, which is very similar, and almost no one is there. So why do they care about this part and not the other part? Well, this wall would have been as close to the temple as you could possibly get. And Jews aren't allowed to go up on the Temple Mount now to the Dome of the Rock without special permission. And even Christians have to get on a list and get permission to go up to the Muslim holy site. And so Jews, you know what they believe about this land, that the Lord will give it back to them. And imagine how painful that is to not be able to go up to the spot that you revere so seriously. Here's a picture of me there. I'm happier than I look. Again, I blame Rod. One thing that's interesting about this area is you can see things, if you go to Jerusalem today, that people have not seen in hundreds or thousands of years. And here's why. When the Romans conquered Jerusalem, they went to the top of the Temple Mount and they just started pushing stuff off. And so you see these rocks that are just huge, bigger than we are, bigger than 2 or 3 of us are, being pushed off. And for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, the Israelites and whoever owned it at the time left those undisturbed as a testament to what had happened. But in the late 1900s, they started to excavate some of this and move some of the rocks, and you're able actually to see some roads, some rocks that would have been there during the time of Jesus. One thing that's interesting is excavations have uncovered 50 or more mikvahs or baptistries. You know, if we don't know about the Jewish history and we come to the New Testament and they talk about being baptized, we might wonder why, first of all. We might, second of all, wonder how it would have been possible. But all around the Temple Mount, they had these big mikvahs filled with water, and people would go down into them to be ceremonially cleansed. I don't want to go up to the temple if I have any outward filth. And so they would cleanse themselves and go up to the temple. So we read Acts chapter 2 and we think 3,000 people were baptized. Well, first we think that's a lot, but it's really not, because 1 million were there or more, right? But 3,000 people. If Michael preaches a sermon so good that 3,000 people come forward, our next question is, how do we handle that? But it's real easy when you see that there were 50 to 100 of these around the Temple Mount. If there were just 50 and 3,000 people were baptized, it means only 60 per mikvah to reach that number of 3,000. Don't you think it would be pretty easy to baptize 60 people and each one pretty quickly? Another part of the temple wall that I mentioned that's so cool to see that less people care about is the southern wall. So this is out again on the Mount of Olives looking out towards Jerusalem. And in this area here, you have the southern steps leading up to the temple. And when you get there, this is what that area looks like. Now this area is pretty famous and for several things I didn't even realize until I got there. But a lot of things happened coming up these steps. Jesus, when he was dedicated as a baby, would have been taken to the temple. People say these would most likely have been the steps that were used. You remember in Luke chapter 2, Jesus is lost for a while. You know, it helps me as a parent if I ever think like, man, I'm not being a good parent. Like Jesus' parents lost him for a few days. It's going to be okay, you know. That really helps me. But when they found Jesus, where was he? He was in the temple, asking questions and answering them. Well, these are most likely the steps that he could have taken to get up there. The good Jews, if you will, would have come to the temple 3 times a year for different religious festivals, and this is where they would have come. The thing that interested me the most out of all those is that these are a lot of things in Jerusalem. People say, or Israel, this is for sure it. And there's no proof whatsoever. It said that if you were able to get all the nails from Jesus, a piece of the authentic nails that they sell, you could build a battleship. And if you get all the real pieces of wood from the cross, you could build a bridge. Okay? So a lot of this stuff isn't real, but about 95% of scholars say that these are the steps that the Pentecost steps that the sermon in Acts 2 would have been preached on. And so it was amazing to stand on the actual steps. The ones closer to the top have been rebuilt and aren't them. But about halfway and down are the original steps that would have been walked on by Jesus, would have been walked on by Peter and the other apostles. And this is most likely the location where they preached that great gospel sermon in Acts chapter 2. And I just thought this was neat. This would have been their view as they looked back towards the Mount of Olives. And they preached in Acts chapter 2. And this would have been their view looking straight ahead, able to see large groups of people, able to see out into the valley and to see the homes of others. One thing that was interesting that Michael wanted me to mention is that the steps themselves, I don't know how well you can see this, probably not well, but the steps have different widths and different depths. So no one can just run up the steps when they go to the temple. But as you go to the temple, you have to look down at your feet and consciously be mindful of your steps. Now, why would they build the steps like that? That's poor planning. Or it was to humble the people as they went up. You know, how would we feel? We're not as physical, and we understand that we're in a new covenant, but what if we built a door like the one at Chick-fil-A, and all of our members had to go through a door like that? Now, everybody wouldn't be able to do that, but just that idea of when we come in, we better have humility, we better humble ourselves is, I think, very good. Next, you can see an area where the Holy Sepulchre, where they believe Jesus was crucified and buried. And this is one of those, no one can prove that it was the exact spot, but it's pretty much the exact spot within a few feet or a few yards. And have on the slide, this is what the area looked like in the first century. There would have been a tomb. There would have been an old quarry that had already been filled in and a garden was planted. And then Calvary would have been on a hill across from the tombs. And all of this would have been outside the city walls. Fast forward to 326 AD, Constantine, I think through the encouragement of his mother, built a church building over this area because it was so widely believed to be the exact spot. But then later, down the road, 1048, that area, as you can see the difference, has been destroyed by the Muslims as they came in, and then eventually rebuilt by the Byzantines and the Crusaders. And that's the church building that you see over the site today. And it's interesting, you think about everything happening outside of the city walls, but the city has grown since then. And areas and homes and businesses that are around it have expanded, but originally this would have been outside the city walls. And you can see all of that from the Mount of Olives. Rod and I got here one day before sunrise, and somehow we were the only people there. And so we had the whole area to ourselves for a couple of hours. Look, proof that I was there. Some things that happened there, Jesus prayed in the garden, of course. He could have seen, as he sat in the garden, looking across the temple, the guards as they came to get him in the dark of the night. Now imagine knowing someone is going to come kill you and watching them come and staying anyway. Now we don't know that Jesus had prayed for another way. That wasn't his ideal of what he would have liked to happen. But since he knew it needed to happen, he allowed it. But this is also the site that Jesus would have ascended back into heaven from. From here, you can see the house where Jesus was tried, the place where Peter denied Jesus, and a potter's field where Judas might have been buried. So a few lessons. It's not about physical water, protection, and presence anymore, but spiritual. We want that John 4 water. We want the protection of God, and we want to be in a new city, the kingdom, the church. You know, I felt a sense of awe in being in some of these places, but in some ways I didn't care, because I'm already in God's kingdom. They looked for a physical place where God would be, but we have that place now in the church. And so we see people longing after that, but in a way we already have some of that. But while I was there, I also met others who were already in that new spiritual Jerusalem as well. I wanted to share this picture. Rod and I, Rod came to get me at the airport, and he missed the train. I'm like, man, you're supposed to live here. You're fluent in Arabic. What a fraud, you know. But he missed the train. But when he missed the train, he saw this guy in the Ghostbuster shirt, which is also funny, wearing a shirt that said Church of Christ. And he ran up to him and said, "Are you a member of the church?" And he said that he was. And Rod and he exchanged contact information. Then later, as Rod and I traveled to the city of Jerusalem, we texted them, and this couple, there's his wife with him, were there, and we texted and we met up. And at the same time, I got a message from somebody on Facebook who I've been Facebook friends with for a long time, but I've never met. It's the preacher on the far right doing the Hawaiian shaka thing, who is the preacher for the Honolulu Church of Christ. And so all of us met up at the same time and explored Jerusalem for my first time together. And how amazing is that we were able to be members already of the New Jerusalem, walking together in the Old Jerusalem. Quickly, I'll share a few more things and we'll be done. On the other side of the wall, a wall that has been built up by the current Israeli government, is the area called Palestine, or the West Bank. It's most famous to us as being the place where Bethlehem is located. Now, this is what Bethlehem looks like. I took this picture on top of one of their national parks, the Herodium, and you're looking out at Bethlehem all over the place. So some desert parts, but some lush parts. And this is a small village just 6 miles south of Jerusalem. Close to the desert, but very lush. Rachel was buried here. Naomi was from here. David was born here. And this is neat. Micah 5:2 says, "But you, O Bethlehem, who are too small to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days." Bethlehem had already produced a great ruler, David, and now it was going to produce the greatest ruler, Jesus. And Jesus was born there. The Herodian National Park is a pretty amazing thing. Herod the Great built 4 great complexes in the area. I mean, he was an amazing builder. And when you're there, my first thought is, man, Herod, this is beautiful. What a guy. But then you remember, no, this is the Herod that tried to kill baby Jesus and ended up killing all the babies in Bethlehem to try to get rid of him. And he was actually an awful person. But this complex, the Herodian, was already here when Jesus was born, and so he would have seen it. You can see it from anywhere in Bethlehem and a lot of places in Jerusalem. There's archaeological proof that's been found here of Pilate, which is impressive, and it's beautiful. But under this, small burial tombs nearby in the Church of the Nativity have been located. They were the size that would have been used for babies. We think of Bethlehem as this big city maybe with hundreds of people, but really there weren't that many. So we're not talking thousands of hundreds of babies that were slaughtered, but more like a dozen or 2 babies that would have been killed. And they found several graves together for children that size. Now, it's only 6 miles from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, and so only an hour walk or so maybe for them. But I want to read 2 verses quickly, and we'll move on to the next section and then finish up. But Exodus 13:12 says, "You shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb." Well, who would that apply to? Jesus. So it's no surprise that when we get to Luke chapter 2, verse 22, Jesus is taken up, 22 through 40, Jesus is taken up and presented at the temple. Good Jewish families traveled to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And it was only a 90-mile trip from where they were in Nazareth to get to Jerusalem. Now, it takes less than 2 hours in a car to go 90 miles, but it would have taken them a week one way. Okay, so think about the practicality of that. You've got to go to Jerusalem from wherever you are in Israel 3 times a year. And for them, it was 1 week there, do whatever they needed to do, and 1 week back. So as much as 6 or 7 weeks of their year were dedicated to going to Jerusalem. Some of us have a hard time going out of town because we have to get somebody to watch our dogs. But they had to go out 6 or 7 weeks out of the year to Jerusalem. So lessons learned from this: 2% of Palestine, that is the area of the West Bank, Bethlehem, less than 2% claims Christianity. Now, for all of those that claim, how many do you think are actual Christians? So we have less than 2% of the country that even claim any relation to Christendom. So the lesson I think from this is, because you were once faithful doesn't mean you always will be. You need constant self-evaluation. And then finally, Jesus uses humble places and people. Where you come from is not as important as where you're going. And then finally, our last section, the South. Now, the Dead Sea is a place that I visited. It was interesting. What do you think of when you think of the Dead Sea? I used to think of like a swamp. You know that land that's in the left on in our Murchie? Like you're out past the mall and it's always got a for sale sign there. And I'm like, why won't it sell? Oh, because it's a swamp and there's always water there, right? So I've always kind of thought of the Dead Sea like that. It's just disgusting. It's like a swamp. Nothing can live there. But I didn't think of it as something that would be beautiful like this. It's not dead because it's ugly. like we think about. It's beautiful. But it's dead because of the high salt content that's there. And the water is so clear, and here's some pictures of the salt formations that are there. It's so clear because nothing can live in it. In Genesis 13:10, it says, Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw the Jordan Valley, this area, was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. So this area used to be an area that was lush and beautiful. And that was before Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed in this area, and maybe that's why there's the high salt content that we see today. The next section is a place called En-Gedi. This is a picture I took from atop of Masada, a national park there, and this is the area around the Dead Sea. You can see it in the distance, and nothing grows there. It's ugly. There's really no plant life there. And in 1 Samuel, it talks about a time when David was on the run for his life from King Saul. Not a good place to have to hide, trying to find food and water that doesn't exist. But in this desert, in this wilderness, David found an unlikely oasis, a place called En-Gedi. You drive through just not many, but several miles of just desert, nothing but death, and then you see this little oasis, and you almost think like it's an illusion because you see all this greenery in a place where there is none. And in 1 Samuel 23 and 24 references this place. And I would like to think this little oasis in the desert was on David's mind when he wrote Psalm 18. It says, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer, my God. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. That would make a good song. But David was smart enough to realize, yes, I found this, but it's not praise for me, but it's praise for God who provided it. And then our last city that we'll look at, and we'll be done, is the city of Beersheba. And this is the place that Rod lives. Remember, we started with saying from Dan to Beersheba. That was the whole territory of God's possession. And here we'll end with the city of Beersheba. It was a city in the southern part of ancient Israel. It's still a city that's here today. Israel actually keeps going into a desert called the Negev. That's the name of that particular desert. But Beersheba marked the southernmost boundary of the land that had been cultivated. And so thus the phrase Dan to Beersheba. It's first mentioned in Genesis 21:14 as the wilderness where Abraham sent Hagar. So he sends her out into this area. Maybe not necessarily wilderness like we think until you get to that Negev. It's also mentioned, and this is important, in Genesis 21:31 as the place where Abraham made a treaty with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. And their treaty gave Beersheba its name. It means the well of the seven or the well of the treaty. Jacob, Isaac, Hagar, and Elijah all heard messages from God while in this area of Beersheba. It's where Solomon's two sons served as leaders. And you remember they were very ungodly and they did an awful job. And it was their corruption that led the people to say, give us a king like the nations around us, because if this is what we've got, we want something else. And this is where they served in that area. These wells at Beersheba still produce water today. So our lessons learned from this last section, something can look beautiful, but actually be dead. That can apply to people, places, and churches. It's more important what we are on the inside than on the outside. And then lastly, God is the source of our strength. Any strength that we have only comes from Him. So then I wanted to share these resources with you and we'll be done. A couple things that I have watched that I've learned a lot about. Some of you may never get to go. This may be the closest you get to go, but there's some really good videos done by members of the church online that you can learn a lot from. The first one I wanted to mention is Bible Land Passages. It's just BibleLandPassages.org. There are 15 episodes. They have pictures and videos that you can download for sermons or lessons for free. They're so good. I can't believe members of the church made them. Does that mean to say, I don't know. But they're so well done, I would have thought they were even more professionally produced than they were. If you have an app called VidAngel, does anybody have that? Or has anybody ever used VidAngel? It's something you can watch TV shows and movies. Ashley raised her hand. Me and Ashley have it. We share an account. I'm the only one. We're the only ones, I guess. But it's an app you can stream movies and TV shows. And it'll take out cursing and nudity and things like that. But if you go to VidAngel and you type in the word Bible, Bible Land Passages is actually the only thing that pops up when you search for the word Bible. But the team that produced these takes a trip twice a year. One in the spring and one in the fall. Ron, you're going with their group in March, correct? So Ron is going to go with the group that produced these in March. And it costs around $5,000 to go. That's flying there, hotels, food, and everything like that. Now, I know that's not possible for all of us, but in light with what we talked about this morning, what about for those of us that could if we sacrificed? How much do you spend on a car or a college education or continuing education classes or, dare I say, a trip to Disney World? What if some of that money was put towards being in a place where we could understand the Bible better for the rest of our life? I would like to see, maybe fired from being a member here or anywhere else after this for that fact, but I would like to see congregations incentivize preachers. Look, if you've been here 5 or 10 years, we'll help you go because you teach us and you'll learn things that'll make your classes even better by what you learn. It'd be good to see our churches do that. But the second thing is, and here's just a snapshot of the site you can go to, BiblePassages.net, to register for the trip, see more information and things like that. But the second group is a group called Appian Media. They're members of the church as well, and they have some great videos. They have maybe 4 or 5 different sets where they walk through and have 15 different videos, and they go to these sites and expand on them. And then the last thing is, again, I just wanted to share my contact information in case you want to get any of the scriptures since I had to fly through them. If you want any of these pictures or videos, if you want to know more about Bible Land Passages or Appian Media, or maybe even going to Israel yourself or sending someone else as a gift. But I learned a lot being there, and hopefully some of these things will help you understand the Bible better as well. So I'll end in a prayer and then turn it over to the elders. Let's pray. Dear God, we love you. Thankful that you are so good to us and you've given us a book that we can understand, even though we haven't been to typically the places that it talks about. And we know you're powerful enough to create the world, so it's no surprise that you could create a book that we would understand no matter when and where we are, no matter our education level or experience. But I am thankful that I was able to go and share these things with the church, and I pray that there'll be some things that stick, that they'll remember, and that'll help their studies as they read the Bible for the rest of their lives. And please help those of us that can go, maybe to do that, not for vacation as much as just an investment in our Christian education. Please help us to encourage others to go, maybe even make that possible for people in our life that we know. Please help us to be good students of the Word, not to depend on anybody else to be our only source of it, but to dig into it ourselves. Thank you for the proofs that we see in the Bible and outside of it and what they do for our faith. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.